To start this panel, I'm going to introduce Federico Bacchiocchi. He is the National Secretary of the Communist Party of the Workers of Italy.
Mi scuso innanzitutto perché parlerò in italiano, ma non sono bravo con le altre lingue. E prima di tutto voglio portare un caro saluto a tutte le compagne e tutti i compagni che partecipano e intervengono in questo importante evento. Io nella mia relazione, che spero sia
In this report,
nel tema che pone questo, nel tema
I
di
hope
oggi,
that
mi soffermerò sul governo italiano,
in this
che è
topic,
stato formato dalle forze che hanno vinto le elezioni nel
I'm going to
25
refer to
settembre
the Italian government,
2022. Mi
which is a
soffermo su
government
questo
that is
perché
formed
credo
by
sia
the
uno dei
forces
governi più a
that
destra
won
dello scenario
the latest
dei
elections
paesi
in
imperialisti
2022.
europei e quindi
The
credo
Italian
che sia
government
abbastanza esemplare
is in fact imposed by a
nel
riding
suo
force,
arrivo al potere
which
e
is one of the
quello che noi
largest.
possiamo combattere.
The largest is Fratelli d'Italia. This
Il
is a
governo
party that is
italiano
heir
infatti
to
è
the
composto dalle
post-war Italian
forze di
fascist
destra,
party.
di quelle di cui
After
quella
various
più
political
grande è
events,
Fratelli
this party
d'Italia.
has collected the
Questo
legacy of
partito è
Alleanza
l'erede
Nazionale,
del partito
a
fascista
party born from the
italiano
dissolution of
del
the Italian
dopoguerra.
social movement. The MSA
Infatti, dopo varie
also
vicende
bears in its
politiche,
name the
questo
ideal
partito ha
link to the Italian
raccolto
Social Republic
l'eredità
led by
di Alleanza
Mussolini,
Nazionale, che
the
era un
fascist
partito
regime
nato dal
that, in
cosiddetto
collaboration with the
Movimento
Nazis and the
Sociale
German
Italiano.
occupation army, governs
Il
northern
Movimento
Italy
Sociale
after the
Italiano
fall of
riporta anche nel
fascism.
nome il suo collegamento
In this
ideale
period, he waged a fierce civil war against the
con la
partisans of
Repubblica
the
Sociale
resistance,
Italiana,
staining himself with
che
countless
era
crimes
la
against
Repubblica che si è
the civilian
formata
population.
dopo la caduta del fascismo e ha governato il nord Italia tra il 1943 e il 1945, guidato da Mussolini. Questo fu un regime fascista collaborazionista con i nazisti e l'esercito di occupazione tedesco. In questo periodo, in questi 2 anni, condusse una feroce
Like I said,
guerra
it's a government of
civile
Italy
contro i
in the
partigiani,
northern area
macchiandosi di innumerevoli crimini
after
contro
the
la
fall
forza del
of
fascismo.
fascism. In this period, there was
Il Movimento Sociale
like I said,
Italiano
a
ha
fierce civil war
rappresentato la
against the
continuità
partisans,
del fascismo nel regime democratico
and they killed
borghese che si è
countless
instaurato dopo la fine
of
della
people.
guerra. Questo però non vuol dire che oggi
The,
Fratelli d'Italia sia un
the
partito
Italian
apertamente fascista.
social movement represented the
Formalmente ha
continuity of
preso le distanze
fascism
al
in the bourgeois
fascismo e
democratic regime
garantisce di
that was
rispettare la
established after
Costituzione
the end of the war.
democratica.
This does not mean that today Fratelli
Tuttavia,
d'Italia is an openly fascist
usa le
party.
istituzioni però per
It was
fare
formally
un'opera di
distanced
revisione storica,
from fascism
soprattutto
and
nei
guaranteed
riguardi della storia della Resistenza
the
e del
respect
movimento partigiano, per
to the
cercare di
democratic
giustificare il
constitution.
fatto che un
However, it
partito
uses
erede
institutions
del
to make a
fascismo
historical revision work,
governi un paese
especially with regard to the
nato
history of the
dalle forze
resistance and the
intersociali.
partisan movement.
Noi
This
siamo
is aimed
quasi, noi del
at
Partito Comunista
justifying
Lavoratori,
that a
abbiamo
party
definito questo
heir
governo
to
come un
fascism
governo a guida
can govern.
post-fascista, cioè appunto un governo guidato dagli eredi del fascismo che
We
oggi
usually
hanno
define the current
sfortunatamente
government
preso le
as a
distanze dal
post-fascist
fascismo.
government.
Le altre forze di governo sono il
The other
partito fondato da
forces in
Berlusconi,
government
Forza
are,
Italia
are the party
e la
funded
Lega,
by
che
Berlusconi,
dopo aver
Forza
avuto
Italia, and the
posizioni
League, that
secessioniste
after having
nelle regioni del
secessionist
nord,
positions in the
oggi
northern
invece è
regions,
posizionata
today
sul
has turned
nazionalismo
to
populista
a heated
reazionario.
reactionary populist
Insomma,
nationalism.
quello attuale è il governo più
In
reazionario
short,
che abbia avuto l'Italia
the
dal
current one is the
dopoguerra.
most reactionary government of the
È un
post-war
governo
period.
vicino agli interessi del grande
It
capitale
is a
italiano
government
e in
close to the
definitivo vuole
interest of the
accreditarsi
large
anche
Italian
presso
capital
l'Unione
and
Europea.
ultimately wants to
È un
be
governo che
accredited
tutela
with
proietta
the
gli interessi
EU.
dell'imperialismo italiano, soprattutto in Africa,
It
ma
is
non
a government
solo.
that protects
E
and
anche
projects
per
the
questo
interests of
sostiene
Italian
fermamente l'idea di
imperialism,
tutelare
as in the
gli
case of
interessi
Africa,
energetici italiani,
which
quelli
for
bancari
this
e quelli del
reason
settore dell'armamento
supports Israel
che hanno
having to
fiorenti
protect the Italian
collegamenti
energy
con lo Stato
interests,
azionista.
those banking and those of
Da
the
questo
armament
punto di vista
sectors
non
that
c'è
have
urgenza
flourishing
al
links
cambio di
with
regime,
the
non è un
Zionist
governo che
state.
vuole cambiare il regime italiano, però ha
From
un
this point of
progetto di
view, it
riforma
does not seek a
istituzionale
substantial change of the
con
regime,
istituzioni
even
che
if it
tengono
has a
per
project of
principio
institutional
distintivo,
reform
diciamo così,
with
il
establishment of
cancelliere,
a premier elected directly by the citizens,
cosa che darebbe molti più poteri al governo rispetto al Parlamento.
or
Quindi
also
c'è
a prime
il
minister.
tentativo di dare una stretta
This will
al
give
regime
much more
democratico
powers
italiano
to the
in
government
senso più
than the
autoritario.
parliament.
Questo è il progetto soprattutto
This is
di
the
Fratelli
project mainly
d'Italia.
of the
La legge invece
Fratelli
si
d'Italia.
porta avanti una legge
The
che
League instead
consente alle
wants
regioni del nord di
a
avere
law
più
that
potere,
allows the northern
soprattutto per
regions to
l'intrattenere una
have
quota
more
maggiore delle
power,
tasse nel proprio territorio e nella gestione dei
especially
servizi
that
sociali
of playing a greater share
complessi
of
locali.
taxes in their territory
Infine,
and in the
poi
management of
l'unità
social
vuole
services,
riformare il sistema giudiziario
such as health.
cercando di piegarlo agli interessi che ha portato, che ha il governo in una lunga
Finally,
battaglia che ha
Forza
da
Italia
tanto
wants to
tempo
reform the judicial system.
con la
On all these grounds,
classe dei
however,
giudici italiani,
the
con la
government
classe
finds
giuridica.
difficulties that are holding it back.
Su tutti questi terreni, però, il
Even the
governo prova delle
premises of
difficoltà che lo
reducing
stanno frenando.
taxes
Anche le promesse di diminuzione delle tasse per la
for
piccola
the
borghesia
entrepreneurial
imprenditoriale e
and
professionale
professional
sono in gran
petty
parte non
bourgeoisie
mantenute
are
a causa
largely
del buco del
unfulfilled
bilancio italiano che è un enorme passivo.
due to the constraints
Ma la natura
that the Italian
fortemente
budget,
antisociale di questo governo è
which has a
dimostrata
huge
dalla
liability.
cancellazione del reddito di cittadinanza, che era un reddito molto basso, che
But the
garantiva un
strongly
piccolo
antisocial
reddito di
nature of this government
cittadinanza.
is demonstrated
Ma
by the cancellation
soprattutto
of
con il
the
disegno di legge sulla sicurezza
citizenship
che è in discussione
income that guarantee a
in queste
small income
settimane,
to the poorest
che è stato
classes,
in un primo momento approvato dal governo, che si vede la
and
natura
especially with the security
reazionaria
bill.
del governo. Questa legge ha un
This
carattere
law has an
apertamente
openly
repressivo
repressive
contro le
nature
mobilitazioni
against
sociali presenti
present
sul
and future
territorio.
social
Vuole
mobilizations.
colpire le mobilitazioni
It wants to
operaie, gli
target
scioperi e i picchetti, le
workers,
manifestazioni studentesche
workers'
e le
mobilization,
mobilitazioni per il
strikes,
clima.
and
Si
pickets,
accanisce contro i
students'
migranti e i
demonstrations,
detenuti, soprattutto le donne e
climate
le donne, i
demonstrations.
settori più fragili. Oggi il suo principale
It
bersaglio sono gli
is
scioperi
especially
operai del
harder
settore della
against
logistica, cioè quello
migrants
del
and
trasporto merci,
prisoners,
e il movimento e contro il movimento
especially
contro il
women,
genocidio in Palestina.
very
Il
one of the
governo
most
però non
fragile
si limita a
sectors.
questo, inasprisce le
Its main target
persecuzioni
today
contro i
is
migranti in cerca d'asilo
worker
con
strike
l'apertura di un centro di concentramento in
in the
Albania,
logistics sector and the
esalta
movement
la famiglia
against
tradizionale
genocide
contro
in
il
Palestine.
movimento
The
LGBT,
government, however, is not limited to
inasprisce le
this.
misure di ordine pubblico nelle scuole dove si
It
esaltano ancora le
intensifies the
fazioni
persecution
civiche
against migrants
reazionarie e
seeking
la proprietà
asylum
privata
with the
e
opening of
disarma le
a
forze armate.
concentration center in Albania.
Proprio l'incapacità di
It
disfare le promesse
increases,
fatte ai
it
propri
also
elettori porta il governo
uplifts
ad
the regional
assumersi la
family
dimensione e di un
against the
partito
LGBT
nettamente reazionario.
plus movement.
Questo
It
può
toughens
rassicurare il
public
consenso
orders
da parte
measures in
della destra alla
schools,
base elettorale
where a new
e
reactionary
raccoglie
civic
anche le stesse
education
forze di
is
polizia.
exalted
Per questo noi
and
abbiamo
to protect
definito in vari
private
comunicati
property.
un governo di polizia.
It also
Però
exalts
purtroppo bisogna registrare che una
and
grande
toughens
quantità
the
di
armed
consensi il
forces.
governo l'ha ottenuto tra i salariati,
Precisely the
le
inability to
lavoratrici e i
fulfill
lavoratori. Le
the
stime del flusso
promises made to
elettorale
its
dicono che
voters
circa il 60% dei lavoratori
leads the
si è
government
astenuto alla
on the
prossima
path of
elezione
repression
e tra quelli che hanno votato il
and an openly
50%
reactionary
votava
profile.
Fratelli d'Italia. E questo è stato decisivo per
This
la
is to
vittoria
recover
elettorale di questo
the
governo.
consensus
Le responsabilità di questo voto operaio alla destra
of the
post-fascista vanno ricercate nella
most
politica dei maggiori
right-leaning
sindacati e della
part of
sinistra
their
cosiddetta
electoral
radicale, ma
base.
che in realtà è una sinistra che
The
fa
electoral base of
la
this government
politica
consists
di
mainly of the middle
centrodestra.
and
La direzione del
petty
maggiore
bourgeois
sindacato, la
classes
Confederazione Generale del
who demand
Lavoro,
a
CGL,
reduction of taxes, the repression of
subordinata ai
migrants,
governi degli ultimi
and
10
the
anni,
end of
i governi
the
Monti, Renzi,
unrest.
Gentiloni, Conte e Draghi. Con le loro politiche di austerità,
On
il
this
taglio dello
basis, the
Stato
government
sociale,
has been
aumento
able
delle spese
to
militari e
concede little
abbassamento delle tasse per le imprese.
in
Non
regards
hanno in tutti questi
to
anni non hanno avanzato
taxes
nessuna piattaforma di
and therefore
rivendicazione
tries to bring
generale.
it
Hanno indetto solo scioperi simbolici
to
e di
give a
scarsissima
response with a
incisività.
policy of law and
Oggi
order.
promuovono dei referendum che inseguono
Unfortunately,
anche un
however,
carattere progressivo hanno, contro i licenziamenti facili e la precarietà
a great
lavorativa,
deal
ma lo
of
fanno invece di
support
organizzare la classe lavoratrice nello scontro con questo
the
governo.
government of the AH obtained
La
among the
sinistra
wage
radicale,
earners,
principalmente il partito della rifondazione
among the
comunista nel
workers.
passato, che al suo massimo aveva alcuni
Estimates of
migliaia di
electoral
voti,
flows say that
si è
about
suicidata appoggiando due
60%
governi
of
Prodi,
workers
cioè governi di
abstained in
centro-sinistra,
the last election,
proprio prima della grande crisi del 2008.
And among those who voted, about 40% voted for Fratelli d'Italia. The responsibilities of these workers' vote to the post-fascist rights must result in the politics of major trade unions and the so-called radical left, but which is actually reformist. The leadership of the largest trade union, the CGIL, has subordinated itself to the governments, all governments of the last 10 years, the governments of Monti, Renzi, Gentiloni, Conte and Draghi, who with their austerity policies of cuts to the welfare state, increase military spending, and they lower taxes for businesses. They have not advanced on any general platform of claims. They have only called only symbolic strikes, and which have very little importance. Today they promote referendums against layoffs, easy layoffs, and job insecurity. But they do so instead of organizing the working class into confrontation with this government. The radical left, mainly the Communist Refoundation Party, which at its best had a few million votes,
nell'elettorato di destra.
committed suicide by supporting the two Prodi governments right before the great crisis of 2008. These governments, in order to meet the needs of Italian capitalism and imperialism, carried out policies of austerity, cuts, and divestments in the welfare state. Continuous and progressive increases in military spending, also promotion of labor precariousness laws, repressive norms against migrants, massive defiscalizations, or decontrolling for the benefit of capitalists while wages fell. In addition, this left or fractions of it that have detached themselves from the PRC have carried out in recent years a policy of collaboration, always looking for a political alliance with the Democratic Party, the party born from what in turn was born from the dissolution of the Italian Communist Party, which today is a liberal bourgeois party. These choices of the CGIL and the radical left, which however is actually reformist,
in generale, lo scenario di crisi in Ucraina e Medio Oriente,
this has paved the way within the working class, increasingly poor to all sorts of reactionary populism.
L'opposizione parlamentare costituita
First,
principalmente
the party of Comico Griscio, then the League of Salvini, and finally Meloni's Brotherhood of Italy. In this way, the right-wing forces assembled on September 2022 won the elections with 44% of the votes, enough to have the majority prize, more than 50% of the representatives in the parliament. This was a note to the far right, the openly fascist and Nazi far right. there are mainly two important formations, Forza Nova and Casapon. These forces are not growing because Fratelli d'Italia takes a lot of political space from the right. Lately, they have been able to achieve numerous demonstrations protected in some way by the government and by the police forces that is instead tend to persecute the anti-fascist militants who protest. In conclusion, the government today enjoys a relative political stability. He has a solid majority in the parliament. He receives the credit of the great Italian capitalists, both for the internal policy with a break on ecological transition, the expansion of temporary work and the liberalization of.
Anche il piano di riarmo europeo rischia di essere un fattore di divisione all'interno del governo tra Fratelli d'Italia e Forza Italia che lo sostengono e la
And the
Lega di
protection
Salvini che
of
invece si
the
depone.
imperialist interests in Africa, the Middle East,
Il
and
suo
South
consenso
America.
infine rischia di essere minato dal rincaro delle bollette energetiche che va a insistere su
It has
una
the legitimacy of part of the EU institutions after Meloni entered the majority that voted for the president of the European Commission. In general, the crisis scenario in Ukraine and the Middle East, the political crisis of France and Germany allowed the government to have more weight in the US. The parliamentary opposition, consisting mainly of the PD and the M5S, is still divided. The electoral interests of the two major parties also diverge and compete. The government's purpose is to be a privileged ally of the US and to use this position to be more important to the EU.
E che sia allargata la fascia di lavoratori che pur avendo un lavoro e percependo un reddito
However, on this point, there are possible difficulties.
vivono in condizioni di rischio di povertà.
Trans policy, the threat of tariffs, and the easing of the Atlantic Pact constitute difficulties for the Meloni government precisely because it wants to appear as the best ally to the US when they are carrying out an anti-EU policy. Economic difficulties also arise for the government. Budget constraints, the German recession, and the decline in industrial production, the near end of funds of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan pose dangers to its stability.
Che abbiamo detto essere un governo post-fascista. Devono avanzare una linea incentrata sull'avvertenza generale di tutto il mondo del lavoro e delle classi su alleate.
Rearmament plan risks being a factor of division within the government between Fratelli d'Italia and Forza Italia on one hand and Salvini's League on the other. His consent, finally, it risks being undermined by the rise of energy bills, which are also weighed by the indirect taxes on consumption, such as VAT, the thirst for public health care, and the ruin of rail transport. Finally, there is also the question of wages and that of poor work. Wages due to decades-long stalemate and erosion due to inflation that mainly affects basic necessities are decreasing their purchasing power. The phenomenon of workers who, despite receiving an income, are poor or at risk of poverty is becoming increasingly widespread. However, it must be admitted that the government at the moment is not endangered by these problems and can also benefit from some economic data, such as the increase in the level of employment, even if to a lesser extent than other European countries. We must then have a revolutionary Marxism. They must advance in a line focused on general dispute of the whole world of labor and its allied two classes on the basis of an anti-capitalist platform that contains the demand of the wages increase of at least 400 net euros. There are many sectors in crisis, the automotive sector, the steel sector, and the component sectors. For this, a radical and mass turning of the labor movement is necessary, and this turning point can only be ensured by the united front of the working class sitting aside of sectarianism. It is necessary to relaunch the anti-imperialist battle against all imperialisms, against the rearmament, and in defense of all oppressed and attacked peoples, such as Ukrainian, Palestinian, and Kurdish ones. First of all, it is necessary to oppose home imperialism, Italian imperialism, and its nationalistic revival against all ambiguities such as imperialist Europeanism, pro-Russian campism, sovereignism, petty bourgeois pacifism, etc., often typical of reformist or centrist leftists. It is necessary to promote the movement of struggle against the repressive policies of the government, therefore against the DDL security, building around it a united front against repression linked to the mass actions of the labor movement. To link the referendums promoted by the trade unions, which we support because of their progressive nature, to the revival of the labor movement against a line of trade union progressives and against any subordinations to the liberal democratic center left. With regard to the political left, we advance the propaganda proposal of the Independent Labour Party on the basis of an anti-capitalist program. In conclusion, I wish we all
alle altre forze della sinistra, cioè in qualche modo facendone terreno anche di conquista per il Partito Comunista dei Lavoratori. In conclusione, e vado a terminare, voglio augurare a tutte e a tutti noi di riuscire a costruire e a dare un
to succeed in building and giving a mass following to the Revolutionary Party in our own country and to the World Party of Revolution in all countries. Thank you for listening to me. The panel, we present Wilhelm Schulz, member of the League for the Fifth International.
Sorry. Thank you, comrades, for the invitation, and happy to speak at your international forum today in charge for the League for the Fifth International, and also greetings to the comrades of the ITO. I have the duty and honor to speak about the specificities of the situation in Germany in the crisis of the European Union and the uprisings of the far right and the military rearmament led by German imperialism in Europe. The extreme right in Europe is on the rise, and it is expanding its position in almost every election in the European Union and its member states. In Germany, where I come from, the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, became the second strongest party in the federal election in last February, with 20.8% of the votes. And in the latest polls, it is neck to neck with the strongest German party, the CDU-CSU, the so-called Conservative Party. All this is taking place in the light of a steady political shift to the right within the party of the AfD. There was a secret conference held at the end of 2023 under the slogan of remigration between representatives of fascists, the AfD, and also members of the Conservative Party, where they planned to have massive deportations, including German citizens, which gained massive attention and also started a huge counter-mobilization movement in Germany. The mass protest took the streets against this conference and mobilized millions of people over several weeks and months. But they framed the protest as a moral issue and not as a class issue. Short after that, the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, was able to adopt the slogan of so-called remigration policies and also recruited 10,000 new members into their own ranks and their organization. The election in February in Germany therefore reflects a general trend towards the right. But there is a somehow unequal polarization where the AfD is massively strengthening itself and the Conservative Party also adopted a new right-wing program, manifesto, while at the same time, Die Linke, the left party in Germany, is appearing as a point of references for the movement against the uprise of the far right. It is Die Linke who attracted tens of thousands new members into their own ranks, who was able to get 4.3 million votes at the last elections. 600,000 of them came from the Green Party, 440,000 came from the Social Democracy, and 320,000 came from the so-called non-voters. But in order to understand the AfD, I will focus on Die Linke a bit later. It is important to have 2 points of understanding what is central and relevant to understand the AfD and its uprising in Germany. First of all, it's the first party which is on the right to the Conservative Party since 1945, which was able to establish itself in Germany. Secondly, since its foundation in 2013, it's a quite young party in the average of right-wing parties in the world and in Europe. Since its foundation in 2013, the party and its right wing has all the time shifted and increased its dominance against the neoliberal and Eurocratical part of the party. Today, the party is dominated by a fascist right. The development of the party, of the AfD, is directly linked to the crisis of German imperialism in times of global value change, which get reconstructed and restructured, and in times of the crisis of the European Union. The Merz government, so the next government in Germany, which will probably get adopted at the 6th of May, so in the next week, has a new solution to solve the crisis of the European Union. This solution is named European Rearmament Policies and Strategy. And it's a reactionary conversion of parts of the metal industry into the arms industry. As one famous example, the Volkswagen car company should partially get transformed into a tank company and an arm sector of the armed sectors in Germany. The expansion of the arm industry is a follow-up for a massive program of subsidies for the financial capital in Germany. The EU could be unified and extra profits could be skimmed off through the overexploitation of the workers of Eastern Europe. But this is no guarantee that this crisis could be solved through a rearmament program, especially as it's linked to the assumption of raising joint debt in the European nation states, where German imperialism sees to get a competitive disadvantage on the question of commonly taken debts on the European level and does not want to accept that program, actually. So if the Merz government is not able to follow this plan, it could be, the AfD could become a factor to support the Conservative Party as a shadow coalition partner in the next government. But this future is uncertain at the moment. But the German state and its government is already implementing parts of the program of the AfD at the moment, such as racist isolationism politics with inner frontiers in the European Union, with anti-wokeism politics, and starting increasing so-called cultural war as well in Germany against, for example, trans identities. But back to the AfD in this process. Yesterday, the German Domestic Intelligence Service, the so-called Verfassungsschutz, reassessed the AfD and now classifies the entire party as a confirmed right-wing extremist force. Until then, the AfD was only considered a so-called right-wing extremist suspect as a federal party, with some Eastern German sections which were openly right extremist parties. There are several reasons why they have this new classification, which are linked to their last electoral campaign. First of all, the remigration slogan after the conference I mentioned at the beginning. Secondly, they, in the interview with Musk, which was held between Alice Weidel, leader of the AfD, the portrayal of Hitler, Adolf Hitler, as a communist, which also shows that there are inner contradictions in the AfD on the question of the economic program. And with the attempt of the slogan, this will be a bit harsh for people who don't speak German now, with the attempt of the slogan Alice for Germany. Alice is the first name of Alice Weidel, which is immediately linked to the old slogan of the Sturmabteilung, the fascist organization, Alles für Deutschland, which means everything for Germany, and which is banned in Germany as a fascist slogan. The reassessment is taking place in the light of a steady shift within the party and its ranks. For example, the former leader of the party, Jörg Meuthen, left the organization in 2022. With him, also a large section of moderate, of the so-called left wing of the party also left the organization. This was not the first time in the ranks of the AfD. We had a comparable process with Frauke Petry in 2017 and with Bernd Lucke in 2015. So that shows some steps of qualitative shifts in the party and its leadership's character. Today, the AfD has 152 seats in the national parliament, the Bundestag. It's the second strongest force, only in the electoral light. On the electoral night, Alice Weidel declared that she wants to chase all the other parties and continue that speed, mainly the CDU-CSU, and wants to shift into a higher gear in this approach. Now they have even more open fascists in the parliament. For example, Matthias Helfferich, who describes himself as the friendly face of National Socialism. Or Maximilian Krah, who trivialized the SS, the Sturmstaffel, the German fascist battalions, and has close ties to Russian and Chinese imperialism as well, which is also showing that there are inner contradictions inside the AfD until today. But where does the steady shift to the right from the AfD actually come from? The AfD is an expression of the break of the historical compromise of the Conservative Party as the main party of the bourgeoisie in Germany after Second World War. And it has a strategic crisis how to engage on the question of the European Union. There was one wing in this Conservative Party which favored a greater renationalization and a strong German currency instead of the euro. The EU itself is an imperialist, neoliberal, and militaristic project dominated by German and French imperialism. The comrade who spoke before me mentioned the weaknesses of those nation states and the increasing of the role of Italian imperialism in that. However, it is by no means the European Union a nation state until today, and it did not fulfill that task. But it's an unequal nation states union with its own dominant capitalist factions in its own interests. In the euro crisis, this historical compromise in the EU has been broken, which was a compromise between an economic region and a so-called welfare state program on the whole European level, which failed. While the right was able to exploit the disillusionment on the question of the European Union. The left has suffered historic defeats, above all the Syriza government and the anti-austerity policies in the early 2010s. In this sense, the AfD has always been a secessionistisch, anti-European, anti-EU party. For related reasons, its foreign policies was always geared towards the Russian imperialism in itself. In this sense, it cannot be a strategic partner for the CSU-CDU at the moment without breaking from relevant points of its own program, of the program of the AfD, or the breaking of the European Union in the next approach of the Merz government, trying to rearm Europe on the whole EU level. As long as this is the case, the right wing will continue to dominate the party. At the same time, it is also continually shifting the program of the government to the right. The AfD is dealing with various bourgeois governments and parties and can therefore help to shape the character of the party of the AfD. One, for example, the Trump administration at the moment. And its engagement to support the AfD in Germany. To date, however, it has increasingly developed into a fascist formation without being needed by the monopole capital in Germany yet. One short point about the development of the supporting structures in the ranks of the AfD. Its supporters at the electoral level in February were predominantly male, but the proportion of women is growing in the support of that party. The AfD is mainly gaining support among young people between 18 and 24. Take, for example, Brandenburg, a state in Germany. Among the 16 to 24 years old people, it was the strongest party with 31%, far ahead of the Social Democracy with 19%. And also far ahead with the former Youth Party, the Green Party, which now has only 6% in Brandenburg, for example. According to some latest polls on the electoral day, also 30 or 38%, depending on the different polls, of the so-called self-declared blue-collar workers said that they voted for the AfD. Particularly, they are strong under the segment of blue-collar workers in Eastern German states. In Thuringia, for example, they gathered 49% under the sector of blue-collar workers. So they're pretty dominant here, and this is also related to the crisis of the social democracy in their governmental politics in the last years. But there's a movement against that uprising of the far right. I mentioned it already. However, the crisis of the rise of the AfD is not only related to the crisis of the ruling class in Germany and the real fears for social decline among the middle classes, it's also linked to the betrayal of reformistic politics in the labor movements. This includes the trade union rooftop organization, DGB, and its support for large parts of the last governmental programs. And this danger could also apply to the next government, where the social democracy is still part of. Because of this problems and strategic crisis, Die Linke has gained massive support by distancing itself both from the AfD and the next Merz government. Neither the Greens nor the Social Democracy wanted to say that during their electoral campaign. And this brings us to the question how Die Linke was able to grow actually from that. Since the end of 2023, there was the split with the so-called Wagenknecht wing, the populist wing in the party of Die Linke. Since that split, 60,000 new members joined the Linke, the party, and it has now more than 110,000 members, so it doubled in its size. It has become a much younger and much more female party, and the leadership has now claimed to be more unified than ever before. The second factor is that it's the only party, as I already mentioned, which is against the cause of rearmament and opposes the neoliberal and racist attacks in Germany. Which is actually not true if you see how they voted for the program of rearmament in the second chamber of German parliament just a few weeks ago. And it represents the so-called anti-fascist firewall against the rise of the AfD. At the same time, it fights for the expansion of welfare state, redistribution of wealth, disarmament, and pacifism, which is not revolutionary anti-militarism. This is corresponding to the actual status quo of the consciousness of the working class movement. It is a reformistic force, and ultimately is Die Linke a bourgeois program within the ranks of the labor movement. But it only focuses on social issues, rents, and the rising costs of living. It is passive on other questions. It does not see that anti-racism and anti-fascism are integral parts of class struggle. Instead of that, it uses and pursues popular front-style politics and rejects the question of open borders to challenge actually the uprise of the AfD. The party historically has different wings, but all of them are different expression of reformistic policies. At the same time, its members expect Die Linke to be in opposition against the next government and the AfD. And this is where the real value of Die Linke lies at the moment, and where we need to challenge it. We must take the new leader of the party, Ines Schwertner, at her word when she says, I quote, without analytical clarity, the party tends towards actionism and presents a new action plan every week that plays no role in the real world. End of quotation. This is where revolutionaries must intervene in this second, and where also the thousands and thousands of activists who want to challenge actually the rise of the AfD and the rearmament of the German state in the crisis of the European Union. We must intervene here to organize joint resistance against the Merz government and have here a united front politics and policies around that, trying to challenge the trade unions and also the weaknesses of the party Die Linke. We need to struggle and fight within and around the party of Die Linke, challenge its dooms politics and policies of its leaderships. For the necessity of an independent class politics to overthrow capitalism, to seek for a revolutionary break with reformism instead of secretly taking over the party. We need an action program for Germany and a plan to struggle or for class struggle to win. Also in the rundown areas in Eastern Germany, and especially there, because the AfD is here massively winning in the ranks of the working class and tries to intervene into the traditional structures and organizations of the working class movements to build here fortresses for their fascist politics. All these struggles are in resistance to the attacks of the ruling class and its murderous gangs on the streets. But we as revolutionaries, we cannot just end fighting the capitalists' excesses of oppression. We must link these struggles to build a revolutionary party. The development of a program starts from the central struggles and the dominant consciousness of the fighting sections of the working class. But we necessarily need to link it to smash the capitalist order worldwide. And I thank you that forums like this are a first starting point to negotiate, to discuss how to actually challenge the uprising of the far right and to win over the leadership of the working class movement all over the world. Thank you for the attention, and sorry for my bad English. I hope you were able to understand what I discussed.
We give floor to Rubén Tzanoff, member of Socialism and Freedom of the Spanish State.
Good afternoon. Thank you for participating of this panel with the title, Where is Europe Headed to? I'll begin by mentioning 4 things that go through the global reality and the European reality. These are the transformations that Trump is promoting to change the order that was proposed after World War II, the intensification of the inter-imperialist dispute for global hegemony, the continuity of the economic crisis that blew out in 2008, but capitalism hasn't been able to solve, and political and social polarization. With this backdrop, I will focus on the topics that are specific that call for this panel. First, militarism. Before going into the topic, let me ask, how does European imperialism locate itself in this dispute? The main dispute is between the US and China, and also Russian imperialism is involved, but European imperialisms are far behind. Some of them are in a backward state, and they are in a reconfiguration of their path with different positions. See the magnitude this has, the impact that the authorities of the European Commission affirm that the Western world, as it was, has ceased to exist. The European territory is not pacified. Between 1992 and 2025, there were 2 wars, one in Bosnia and the other one in Ukraine, which has a continental impact that is huge, which is just 2 hours from Berlin and 3 hours from Paris. So we cannot avoid Ukraine. War there has a dual nature because the sovereignty process of Ukraine interferes, and also the inter-imperialist dispute. That's why we support the Ukrainian people's right to self-determination, but we also denounce NATO and global imperialism. We need to reject negotiations between Trump and Putin behind Ukraine's backs, because it implies voluntarism, loss of land, like we have always done with an independent perspective from Zelensky's government. With Ukraine, the imperialist powers don't propose immediately or directly a confrontation. But if the crisis grows, there is a risk for a world war that could cause a nuclear holocaust. So we reject inter-imperialist wars. And we don't position ourselves behind any imperialism because among them there is no progressive field. We demand the dissolution of NATO and also of the collective security treaty. The European Commission is trying to seek a social justification for a plan that first called the European rearmament and 48 hours later changed the name to call it Prepared 2030. Around this, they have issues to make it real. They exaggerate, they lie, they make campaigns. They say that there is an expansionism of Putin over Europe, and now they're calling to buy a survival kit for an eventual emergency or nuclear crisis. But beyond this, it is a fact that the goal of the rearmament exists. And it is not something new. The governments are executing the commitment of allocating 2% of their internal GDP to military spending. They're just increasing it. It implies 800 billion in spending. The Spain's government wants to reach that goal this year. Like Willy said, they want to reactivate the capitalist industry of death. Most of the arms purchasing were outside of Israel. They say, oh, buy Europe. To this, we say no to rearmament, to death and massive destruction as a business. And the resources have to be allocated to something else, like housing, employment, salaries, healthcare, education, social rights of the workers, and the European people. Then about the far right. I'm going to talk about one of the phases of the polarization that I mentioned earlier, which is the rise of the far right. Without saying too many information, Orban in Turkey, Meloni in Italy, and the two pillars of the Europeist project, France and Germany. Le Pen grew, and also Alternative for Germany. Last year elections and all of the later ones, there was an increase of the ultra sectors in the government. Reform UK won by a landslide over the laborist movement. They gained the first mayor. Even though the far right of Europe and Spain, they are heterogeneous, they have points in common. Like what Federico said and Willy said, they propose the cutting off rights to workers and women, the LGBT plus movement, activists who defend the environment, and also those who defend Marxist ideas. And I want to highlight something. The criminal nature that is also racist and anti-human of the Europe fortress, because they let migrant people die at sea, they deny asylums, they exploit people without rights. And like the comrade explained, it is a project that was started by Meloni, but now the European Union is picking it up. They put as a third party the management of asylums. Falsely, they put the blame on migrants to eliminate the culture of Europe, unemployment and insecurity. But these are issues caused by capitalism. We need to see what happens with institutions, because the attack by the dominant classes needs to install more authoritarian regimes to repress any type of opposition. In Europe, there are parties that insist with fascism to bring water to their side of lesser liberalism. But we cannot affirm that there is identical regimes to Hitler or Mussolini. At the same time, it would be a mistake to underestimate the right wings and the more far-leaning groups. We need to defeat them before they are able to create similar regimes to traditional fascism. The far right is moving forward with the crisis of capitalism, of the bourgeois democracy, its parties, the normalization of the institutions and the media, but the main factor is the role, the capitulating role of the reformist parties. In Greece, the precursor in 2004 was Syriza, and this spread to other countries. For example, here in the Spanish state, Podemos was born as an expression of the outrage of the 15M in 2011 against the caste, with partisanship, the regime of 78. But in time, it moderated its proposals to prioritize elections and offices over the struggle and paved the way. It gave us a step back with the government of the PSOE as a progressive phase. In that process, the PP was strengthened. Vox, which is far right. In Argentina, you may know it because it is a good friend of Milei. And also others like the party's over, with its own characteristics. So here also, to defeat the far right, we shouldn't fall in the mistake of previous failed recipes like centuries, coalitions, popular fronts. What we need is unity of action on the streets. The united front with political independence, self-defense, and also ideological confrontation. On the third topic that we have in this panel, the alternatives. The dark phase of polarization that I have already described, we have another phase, a positive one, that has multiple expressions, mobilizations, strikes, and rebellions that are repeated one again and again, but they do not have a revolutionary leadership. In Europe, there is social base to confront the far right. There is a revulsive of broad sectors of society and the vanguard that is becoming radicalized. We've seen it in demonstrations in Germany, France, actions against neo-fascism of Europe that we saw in Greece and other places, and there are anti-fascist movements as well. In the last couple of years in Europe, there were struggles against layoffs, job insecurity, pensions, and other social rights. There were some important ones in France and in the UK, where the workers' movement retook strikes after many, many years of the defeat that Thatcher brought. In Spain, nowadays, we see the massive claim for housing, and in Europe, feminist movements in the defense of the environment with the youth on the front line, they never stop fighting. And here is a paragraph, a special paragraph, because I want to highlight that Europe is the scenario of one of the biggest demonstrations in the world against the genocide, the Zionist genocide on Palestine. And this wasn't stopped by persecution or repression or threats. So we need to support all of these struggles, boost self-organization, knowing that workers are not defeated. And in Europe, there are some of the battalions of the workers' movement with an eruption can change the way. For us, it is evident that capitalism in crisis is unable to satisfy the needs and the democratic rights and social rights of the workers. So we have a solution that has nothing to do with Europeans or with skeptics. Our strategy is a Europe where workers rule, as part of a federation of republics. There are socialists. So, the answer to the question at the beginning, where is Europe headed to? Of course, it depends on the class struggle, of what happens with the changes that Trump is implementing. But it is probable that Europe will navigate through treacherous waters, crises, wars, rebellions, and strikes that surely will cause new political processes, realignments, and opportunities for revolutionaries. Our challenge is to contribute to overcome the crisis of the leadership, together with new groups, new parties. We need to build strong organizations that are socialist and revolutionary, which we also need tactics towards new phenomena, like Die Linke, like Willy mentioned. To sum up, I want to share the joy that I feel because I'm participating in this panel with the comrades Federico, Willy, and because of the progresses of the ISL in regards to the political relationships with other European organizations. This is a proof that the rise of the reactionaries does not eliminate the possibility of regrouping revolutionaries with a principist program. If we move forward in this unity, we will reach new opportunities on the road towards a new international, up to the task of this context of socialism versus barbarism.
Big questions, and also to the comrades on the panel, again, thank you for your contributions. I will try to answer all the questions, but I think I can answer more than I will have time, actually, on that important questions. On the question of rearmament and the cuts in Germany. I think last week there was a publication that Germany is now on 4th place in the world on their absolute expenses on weapons in the world. So after US, China, and Russia, Germany is now on 4th place in the world. And this is before the Merz government voted on a general sum of 500 billion euro they want to spend in the next 10 years on the general rearmament of Germany. Just to give you a small number on that. If this expenses, which will be 3.5% of the GDP of Germany, will be fulfilled, then the factor of intensifying the military spendings per year in Germany are 3 times higher than 10 years ago in Germany. So we are really talking about a massive rearmament of Germany, and it wants to become a factor in military operations with or without European Union. This also raises the question, where will the money come from? So there was a voting to get rid of the so-called debt brake from German constitution, which forbids to get more debts or raise more debts for state on expenses. There is no debt brake anymore for arms and weapon industries. This will be a massive financial increase for parts of the German bourgeoisie. And I already mentioned that they want to transform parts of the car industry into ammunition factories and tank factories. What are the concrete plans? At the moment, Germany is discussing to intensify its drone program. It started to become to emerge to be the strongest artillery ammunition producer in the world. Germany is already producing more artillery ammunition per day than the US imperialism is able to do. Just Russia is one step closer or farther here. And as I mentioned, the fusion between Rheinmetall and Volkswagen, or parts at least. But this is also linked to a huge program of so-called investment, which I would describe as massive privatizations of welfare state institutions and infrastructures, which is also a subsidy program for finance capital and huge capital districts in Germany. They want to sell out huge parts of the housing or public housing sectors and have pushed them into a private-public partnership program. Already in Germany, rents were increased in the last 10 years massively, and this will intensify, probably, if we don't fight against that. Future is never certain, and revolutionaries shall challenge the future perspectives of their own bourgeoisie. But I will just present the plans at the moment. There will also be massive attacks on unemployment money. They want to get back on a sanction system. They will massively attack the so-called 8 hours day and want to have a maximum work week capacity of 42 hours. So you can work 24 hours a day. As long as you don't work longer than 42 hours a week, that's no problem. So in the traditional achievements of the working class movement, they want to challenge that. This is also trying to re-establish the German economy, which is shocked by and what was dependent on global supply chains and the period of globalization. One example. The German state is massively dependent on fossil energies and has no strong own sources for that. The main importer of Germany was the Russian imperialist state. That was immediately cut after the attack on Russia on Ukraine and intensified the costs for energy for the industry, but also for the population in Germany. Here is a clear bloc for confrontation line, which the AfD challenges, because the AfD has a different position on Ukraine. It is against any funding of the Ukrainian state, against any military support and arms shipments, and wants to increase the links to Russian imperialism and to Putin. This is a strategic threat for German monopoly capital and its strategic orientation at the moment. It's a strategic threat for the Conservative Party, and they must get rid of that. You can also see a split here in the European far right on the question how they related to their own capital and to their own state power, actually. Meloni is the most famous example here, which is actually capable and accepting the politics of the central bourgeoisies in the European Union and their politics on Ukraine, at least much more than the AfD is at the moment. So AfD must break with its policy, or German capitalism must have a new orientation to get here into a joint force with the Conservative Party. On the question on the demonstrations, which was Rosen, yeah, we had massive and have massive demonstrations against the AfD and the breaking of the so-called firewall because of the joint voting against migrants between the Conservative Party and the AfD end of Germany this year. 100,000s and thousands of people attended on demonstrations, and there is a huge potential to build up actually an anti-fascist mobilization. But these protests are not they are mainly on moral levels and moral layers. Like, you should not speak to fascists, but don't have an analysis how the fascists were able to rise, and don't want to challenge the policy of the German government, of the Merz government and the social democracy. We need to intervene into that and show that also the rise of the far right is linked to the crisis of German capital, and we cannot fight them with popular front politics on that level. So it's actually, we need to establish here what was the question, to get also to intervene into the crisis of bourgeois politics and not just the rise of the far right, which is objectively linked to that, but not the main question in the movement against that. I cannot speak longer about that problem, but let's get to Die Linke. There were several questions about Die Linke. One short answer is, sadly, in Germany, we need to fight for such a structure. There is no party in the first chamber of parliament which is anti-Zionist. We only have Zionist parties in the parliament. And supporting the Zionist existence and right to existence of the Israeli state is bound to the constitution of the German state, and it's hard to challenge it, but we will fight to challenge it anyhow. So Die Linke is a Zionist party as well. It voted actually, or it abstained on the question on implementing the IHRA, anti-Semitism definition, in the German parliament. It abstained on that question. It abstained also on the question on authoritarian attacks on universities against the campus protests in solidarity with Palestine. So it's actually not a functioning corpus to challenge the authoritarianistic threats in Germany at the moment here. This is a situation where we must intervene into as revolutionaries, because it's immediately linked to the rise of the AfD, which is completely supporting the genocide of the Israeli state in Gaza. And just as an example how we intervene, today and yesterday and tomorrow, there's a huge left trade unionist conference organized by Die Linke. We yesterday had a panel and spoke on a panel at this conference where 2,000 trade unionists are present at, and argued that we need to fight for an anti-Zionist politics as well in the trade unions as in Die Linke. And we actually were able to polarize the auditorium here on that question and challenge the leaders of Die Linke on that question as well. But we cannot just focus on the question of Palestine. We also need to focus general questions. For example, the armament sector in Germany. We also need to bring Die Linke into a mobilization against that. We are doing this at the moment. We are planning a joint demonstration at mid of May against an ammunition factory, which will be built in Berlin, the city where I am at the second. But we also started to have first discussion events together with branches of Die Linke all over Germany. They invite us over to have joint talks here on the question, for example, of what is revolutionary Marxism, history of Trotskyism, reform or revolution. And there are first discussions. We actually get invited to have a podium into the party of Die Linke at the moment. Our comrades join the organization and take part of the branch meetings of Die Linke at the moment. And we want to take them where they are at the discussion, last sentence, which are how to actually have a party which is able to get rid of the politics of the next government. And here we are also pushing forward to expel those parts of Die Linke who voted for the massive rearmament program and for the massive privatization of public state property. Here we need to have a discussion about what program does Die Linke need, and this cannot be a reformistic, transformative program in times of war. This is actually the capitulation on the working class and the ruling class in Germany, and reformism is here a threat for the working class, and we need to dismantle it. And this is fight we need to bring forward in Die Linke, because at the moment it's a central point of organization where people get attracted to. Thank you.
First, on the topic of BRICS,
yo no percibo que
I don't feel like
que los BRICS como
BRICS
bloque
as a bloc
estén apareciendo. Acá es la
are
alternativa, son los
appearing
BRICS.
as an
Eso
alternative.
Pero,
Not that.
ojo,
But
que sí,
be
he
careful because
escuchado
I've
tal
heard
o cual comentario. Muchas
some
veces
comments.
recordemos que
Let's remember that
acá están los campistas, tienen
here we have
precios, son ellos los que
campists. They have weight. They are the ones that
este tipo de
promote
cuestiones.
these kind of matters.
Pero no me quiero quedar en esto, de una
But I don't want to
percepción,
stay
un
here in a
comentario.
perception, a comment.
Estamos en un
We
momento
are in a moment
donde el
where
imperialismo
imperialism,
hegemónico, aunque
the
debilitado,
hegemonic imperialism, even though
socialismo
it is
y demás,
weak because of
sigue siendo
losing
dominante,
its
pero debilitado se quiere
Stalinist
recuperar. Entonces,
partner,
en ese
is trying
proceso
to
impulsa
recover.
Trump de
In that process that
recuperarse,
Trump is
lo estamos atravesando.
implementing,
Entonces,
we
puede
are
haber
going through
cambios,
it.
va a
So there
haber
can be
cambios,
changes.
hay de hecho
There will be
algunos.
changes. There are some
Entonces,
already.
creo que tenemos que ser cuidadosos
So I think we need to be
en nuestro
careful
discurso con
in this ongoing
las
process
respuestas.
with the
¿Por qué
response.
digo esto? Porque no
Why do
hablo
I
de
say
los
this?
BRICS,
Because
pero sin
I don't see the
embargo,
BRICS thing,
algunos de los
but
componentes de los BRICS
we can link
se
to some of the
empiezan a
components
ver
of
de
the
otra
BRICS.
manera.
We
Por
can
ejemplo,
see them in some way. China,
en Bielorrusia, por ejemplo,
in Belarus,
tiene intereses por el camino de
has
los
interest
megaproyectos
for the Silk Road
hace
and
mucho tiempo, pero con
big
los
projects
cambios
for a long
actuales,
time.
por ejemplo,
But with current changes,
hace 15 días, el
15 days
presidente de
ago,
España se
the
fue a
president of
China
Spain went to
para
China
ver si a partir
to
de
see
los
if,
cambios que propone
with
Trump,
some
podía
Trump
avanzar
changes,
en los negocios
can
con
move forward
esa
in
potencia
businesses with this
imperialista de
imperialist
Oriente.
power of
Entonces,
the East.
¿qué quiero decir con esto?
What do I mean with this?
Estamos en medio
We are in the
de
middle
cambios
of
y ver
changes
cosas nuevas. Por ejemplo,
and seeing new
no es lo
things.
mismo si Rusia
It is not the
pierde la
same
guerra
if
y
Russia
sale
lost the war than
triunfante,
if it
o
won the war,
uno de los integrantes de los BRICS, de los más importantes,
like as one of the
si sale
main
triunfante del
members of BRICS,
conflicto.
if it comes
Entonces,
out winning
India
in this
es una
conflict.
potencia.
India is also a
Yo no
power.
percibo que haya ya
I don't feel like
BRICS
there is, like the
como bloque,
BRICS
como una alternativa,
appear as a bloc, as
pero
an
en un
alternative,
momento de cambio,
but in
algunos de
a
sus componentes
moment of
vamos
change,
a ver
some of
qué
its
sucede
components,
en función
we will see
de
what happens in
cómo
the
le va a
future.
Trump, si impone o no
Also, we see
esos
how
cambios
Trump
estructurales que quiere
does,
lograr.
if he can impose
Una segunda
his
cuestión,
structural changes.
una segunda pregunta o
Another question
comentario ligado
or comment
a si hay disputas o
linked
más
to
dominio
if there's
financiero. Para
more
mí lo
disputes or
primero que
more
tenemos que aclarar
financial
es que
dominion.
cuando
I want to clarify that
que en nuestra opinión más
our
general
opinion,
se ha
our general
agudizado la
opinion,
disputa. Y es un gran
the dispute
llamado de
has been
alerta
sharpened
porque ya sabemos cuando se
because
pelean
we
entre
know that
imperialistas
when
cuál es el
imperialists fight
final
each
o
other,
cuál
we
fue la
know what the end
representación
is.
final del camino.
We know what the
Pero
end of the road
el
is.
punto fundamental
The
es
main
que
point
haya disputa no
is
niega que
that
también negocian.
if there's dispute, it doesn't mean that there are no businesses.
Rusia disputa
Russia
en Europa del Este con
disputes
la OTAN
in
y los Estados
Eastern
Unidos y
Europe with
hasta
NATO
juntarse Trump
and the
y
US,
Putin.
and now they got together.
Una no quita la
You know,
otra,
Trump and
pero
Putin
creo
got
que
together.
domina la disputa, compañero, porque
The dispute
desde
dominates.
2008 hasta ahora lo que hay
Since 2008 to this day,
la profundización y
there
continuidad
has
de la
only
política
been
capitalista. Y eso
the
nos ha
increase and the
colocado
worsening of the
en
crisis.
disputar áreas
And this has led us
económicas de
to
influencia,
disputing
políticas,
areas of
militares y
economic
demás.
influence.
Ojo, tampoco quiere decir que
But be
el poder
careful, it doesn't
financiero
mean
cayó,
that
porque sigue existiendo
financial
el
dominion
capitalismo
fell because
imperialista. Entonces,
imperialist capital
pero donde
still
tenemos que
exists.
centrarnos, creo yo,
But we need to
es
focus, I think,
en que está dominando
on that it
un
is
momento
dominating. We are in a
profundas
moment of
transformaciones que busca Trump,
deep
los resultados no
transformations
están
that Trump is seeking
definidos
with
y
an
están
undefined
generando más
result,
desorden,
and this is generating more disorder
que ya generó la
on
crisis
top of the
capitalista. Entonces me parece que
disorder
sí,
that the capitalist
hay que
crisis
reafirmar
caused.
que lo que hay
We need to affirm that what we have is more
Lo
dispute.
último, la pregunta sobre Ucrania. Bueno,
The question about
va a
Ukraine.
haber ¿cómo se llama? El panel posterior, vamos a tener
We will have
protagonistas de lujo.
in the next panel we have
Sobre Ucrania, pero
panelists on
sí
that
quiero decir dos
situation.
palabras,
but I want to say two things about it. The war is in Ukraine, but the shockwave, the first Europe is being hit first. So it's all the same. For example, the imperialist superstructure of Europe is on Zelensky's side. But Germany and other countries depended on the energy businesses with Putin and with Gazprom. And they had to change the entire European matrix to receive energy from other places. It is a huge change, and it has a great effect. Like Russia, Ukraine, they were, before the war, great exporters of tons of cereals and crops to feed humanity, and that was stopped as well. Even Russia had to lean to negotiating with BRICS and China. So there are many consequences of all kinds. Economic kinds, governments of the European Union used all this, also the pandemic, to implement some measures of tightening, of cuttings. This has consequences on society. There are millions of Ukrainians all over Europe seeking asylum. Obviously, this has not the characteristic of Palestine, but also this influences on the continent, of the European continent. And it has a dimension in people's heads. When I tell you 2 hours from Kiev, 2 hours from Berlin, 2 hours from Paris, what I want to say is that for Europeans, this war is right next door. So all the real facts and propaganda are of the direct discussion of what happens. The other day there were no lights. The lights went off. An entire day. So people went out to buy the kit that the EU proposed. And they discussed things like, oh, what happened? Is this a sovereignty attack? Because the European Commission is using the war in Ukraine to say, be careful that Putin can come here with his tanks. So imagine. So being away, you see the war, but here, it affects in every level, superstructure, people, in every level. So we have many of these consequences with an additional problem in Europe. During the intervention, I talked about that here we have big demonstrations for Palestine, but it is not the same for Ukraine. Everything is divided because campism, in its pacifist version, ends up supporting Putin. So I only listed some of the consequences. Maybe during the next panel, the comrade will do this. But here war feels like a daily thing, and it feels very direct. That's on the questions.